Okay, thank you, John. Yes, I'm Martyn Silgram, and this project on improving natural resource management by developing pesticide risk assessments using Earth observation. This was delivered with my colleagues Greg Hughes, who's here in the audience today, and Rebecca Jones, both from ADAS, and with Todd Sawar from Resatec, our subcontractor. Just to give you a brief overview, Juncus rushes have both an ecological and an economic impact on the environment, particularly the upland environment. They typically receive herbicides like glyphosate and MCPA, and these can leach into watercourses. They can be difficult and expensive to treat, and so there's a potential risk of breaching water quality standards, regulatory standards in the case of the Water Framework Directive. So we've been working closely with our stakeholders in the Welsh Government, in Natural Resources Wales and within Welsh Water to develop a prototype of a cost-effective, targeted and practical solution to try and help better target some of these applications to control rushes. We've been using very high-resolution Earth observation data, which you'll hear about in a moment, and that's enabled us to look at both the abundance of rushes spatially and temporally, but also use that information within the further development of a pesticide risk mapping exercise. So a bit more detail. I mentioned about the impacts of rushes. Here's some examples what it looks like for those unfamiliar. Ecologically, only about 30% rush presence in a field is enough to have a serious ecological impact based on some RSPB data that I've cited here. And half of that, only 15% presence, has rather dire financial implications from the point of view of a land manager. You can be losing up to £200 per hectare in the value of your big bale silage in an upland environment. So there's a significant reason to do something about it, as well as the environmental benefits of improving water quality. Now, we know from work with Welsh Water and other people that MCPA has been identified as a potential cause of water quality breaches, and it tends to be associated with these rushes in areas like the Upper Wye in mid-Wales. So we chose that area as a candidate, a sort of test study area, at around about 1,000 square kilometres. So about 1,000 holdings, farm holdings, over 17,000 fields, the grassland fields, huge area to deal with. And you can see an example of the concentration failure here with MCPA in some Welsh Water data. So faced with that challenge, it's a little bit daunting. Where do you start? Where do you start to target any interventions with farmers, any treatments, any dialogue, any engagement with a range of stakeholders? Well, in this project, we've used a risk mapping approach, using a combination of intrinsic risk that was developed a year or two ago with some specific pesticide risk that's been developed in this project using the Earth observation information. And that's enabled us to help prioritise the limited staff resources that agencies like NRW have, target those sorts of intervention activities and build the evidence base that we can use to demonstrate to stakeholders that a cost-effective solution does exist if we do it in the right place at the right time. Ooh, help. That's not supposed to happen. There we go. Okay. Normally, you might apply this herbicide in the top photograph everywhere, slap it all over. Not very good if you're in a vulnerable situation next to a river, maybe. The bottom photograph shows you a weed wiper solution, which is a targeted bit of kit. It applies it a bit on a sponge-like device at height, so you protect the underlying grass understory. You're only applying the herbicide to the tall rush vegetation. But you need to know where to do that. The kit costs money, so you only want to do it where you need to do it. And this method helps you identify the right places to do it. So we've developed this processing chain that helps overcome the existing constraints in an intrinsic pesticide risk map that my colleague Greg Hughes developed a couple of years ago for Aquia, which has some merit but doesn't have that spatial and temporal precision in terms of where to apply things to that we can get from identifying the presence of Juncus from EO. And we can focus that onto the high-risk areas. That's better. So just to say a little bit of word about the intrinsic risk mapping that was developed earlier. Essentially, this uses a set of geospatial data sets, including soils, drainage, and we can whiz through those, drainage, land cover, slope, proximity to surface waters, and climate. Ooh, I'm still doing that. Climate, there we go. And that was used to develop an intrinsic map. So the farmer can't do anything about that. That reflects his landscape that he's got. Okay, that's a starting point. So how can EO help us? Well, by identifying the specific presence and abundance of Juncus species from Earth observation, that can really pin down and refine any risk assessment methodology. So within this project, we used a series of rapid eye images, very high resolution rapid eye images, multispectral ones, and coupled with supporting information on soils data. We trained the information, when we were looking at spectral characteristics that were specific to Juncus, we used the local biological records centre information, although this wasn't quite as good as we maybe thought it might be at the beginning, so it needed to be in terms of spatial resolution. So we supplemented this with some detailed field scale validation, ground validation of over 100 fields, so that we could have some confidence in the limited time scale we had available. We could have some confidence in the identification of the presence of the Juncus rushes. So it was a combination of the local biological record centre data and ground truthing. But there's always room for more ground truthing. We'll come back to that later. In terms of output products, by looking at the Juncus presence, the first output product, fairly obviously, is a map of abundance. That looks a bit like this. Now, this is pixel-based, which is quite interesting because we end up with two different spatial resolutions of output products here. We can aggregate it up to sort of whole field scale, which is useful for policymakers, for NRW, for thinking about which fields and farms to visit. That's great for those people, and this is aggregated to quartile distributions in the bottom picture. But we could also have that raw pixel-based classification that's a higher spatial resolution, and that gives us information that's of greater value to a land manager, where there might be an association, for example, with a change in soil type, or a linear feature like a poorly maintained old drain from Victorian times, quite often exists in this sort of landscape, in which case you get a linear feature in your rushes. So we can present this in different ways for different stakeholders who need slightly different things at different resolutions, but using the same output product. We also have this intrinsic pesticide risk, which now includes both a surface and a subsurface pathway. And that methodology is robust based on comparison with daily information on water quality. But if we look at, this is normalized in terms of the scale, but the dark areas are the higher risk in our test catchment area. So if we compare that with the output when we have then used the information on the left with the Juncus presence to refine the pesticide risk to come up with a specific risk that takes account of where the Juncus actually is, then we end up with a rather different looking map, much more focused. You know, that would tell us to focus up in the far northeast and in the south of the catchment in terms of our interventions where NRW may wish to send staff to talk to farmers. So rather than a scattergun approach that's rather unfocused and wasteful in terms of resources, we have the opportunity here to better target limited resources and maybe target those weed wiper methods to places where they will be most effectively used in terms of their impact on water quality. So we had quite a protracted engagement process both before, during and after this project with a group including the Welsh Government, Natural Resources Wales, Welsh Water and United Utilities, a working group that already existed specifically focusing on where to best target this weed wiper method by encouraging, for example, the development of machinery rings to share the cost of the kit. And landowners themselves through NFU. So together with all those organisations, that helped us identify that test area in the Y in the first place, also helped us tremendously in getting hold of some of the data that we used for training the classification algorithm for Juncus, but also we found in the meeting we held last month with the stakeholders, we got some really positive feedback about the value of that, and I think those stakeholders rather wished that had some of this information a year or two ago, to be perfectly honest. That was the impression we got. You know, further work needed, as always, with these things. But as a proof of concept, we were really quite encouraged by the feedback we got and the potential, the encouragement about the potential value of this type of product, which doesn't have to be specific for Juncus. The same principle could be applied to other problematic vegetation types that receive herbicide treatments. So in terms of benefits for end users, well, we've got this new processing chain that includes identifying the presence of a particular problematic rush, which we know receives a particular herbicide, which gets into water. So we've got an abundance product, and then we have a second product, which is the specific pesticide risk map that can guide and inform the targeting of any interventions on the ground, and also used for planning and policy purposes. In terms of, I mentioned the ecological impacts at the beginning of the talk, but there's also potential economic benefits here. Obviously, they're difficult to quantify in a little phase 1 project. There'll be a lot more detail on the economic impacts in phase 2 in a separate work package, but you know, we can think about the more cost-effective targeting of any interventions, the fact that we're reducing the risk of breaching water quality standards and associated fines, and perhaps more strategically, the ability operationally to look at changes over time, which EO offers us. So we can look at changes due to management interventions or changes due to the gradual encroachment of vegetation types such as Juncus, as well as any societal benefits. Now, we did do some back-of-the-envelope calculations just to give you a flavour for some of the economic benefits that are possible. Now, half the grass fields we looked at didn't have any Juncus to start with, so that's great. We don't have to worry about those, but what it has enabled us to do is focus on those areas which do have this problematic vegetation, which could receive the herbicide. And that by focusing any visits from organisations like NRW, you're able to save money, save time, in terms of staff visits rather than a scattergun approach, visiting every farmer in an area. That's got significant financial implications, not only in terms of the time, but also in terms of the reduced engagement period that's needed to try and achieve the same impacts in water quality improvement and compliance. And within a farm environment itself, it helps you target specific treatments and would inform you where the weed wiper approach will be most effectively used and should be used because of the higher risk land. And we estimated that around about there was an 80% reduction in specific pesticide risk due to this approach in our test catchment area compared to a scattergun approach that didn't involve EO. Certainly the data that we've looked at from other work has suggested that by reducing this risk, there is a commensurate reduction in the occurrence of problematic herbicides like MPCA in the associated surface waters. In terms of business models, well, you could do this annually in the case of cutting this sort of rush vegetation, or you could do it if you were thinking about the encroachment of a vegetation naturally, then you might 3 to 4 year frequency would probably suffice. So depends on the purpose there, two different options to work with. But either way, this approach allows you to target specific herbicides, specific land uses with vegetation types, and also, of course, focus on particular priority areas of concern in terms of catchment water quality. We did learn some lessons. There was a little bit of confusion between two particular types of vegetation that we hope to resolve further when we do more ground truthing in phase 2. We were rather disappointed with the lack of spatial precision in some of the LBRC data, so that maybe is an opportunity. I think that probably highlights the benefits of EO, if anything. It highlights that we're bringing something to the table that doesn't exist in the geostatistical information. So it's a good thing, actually. And we can overcome that through a more comprehensive ground truthing campaign in phase 2 to improve the accuracy of our Juncus classification algorithm. And certainly this project, which has been quite inspiring really, has facilitated this cross-sector engagement with a range of public and private sector stakeholders that's been quite fascinating, with slightly different takes on what they want, but ultimately interested in trying to get to the same endpoint, which is a novel, cost-effective solution. And certainly they're curious about EO. So in summary, we used a multispectral, very high resolution Earth observation approach, in this case with rapid eye, but it doesn't have to be, coupled with NBN and ground truth data to develop both this abundance algorithm and a specific pesticide risk map product. We managed to achieve around 70% classification accuracy in this short trial. We only had a few months to do that. That's not good enough. I'd like us to get up to 80–85%, but with further ground truthing in phase 2, and if we bring on board other satellite imagery options, perhaps SAR, and look at other timings of acquisition of optical, I'm confident that we can get to that point where it's operationally practicable. And so that's really the next step. We've made significant progress, I think, in demonstrating a proof of concept here, and engaging with a wide variety of public and private stakeholders. But in order to take this to the next stage, we need to think about more extensive field calibration and survey, so we can get that accuracy of the classification up, demonstrate the principle applies to other problematic vegetation types associated with other herbicides, and think more carefully about the best way to optimize the choice, timing, selection and resolution of the EO imagery that we use, compared to the rapid eye imagery we happen to use in this particular project demonstration. But ultimately, the stakeholders are very encouraging that there's the possibility here to develop an operational product in the future through phase 2. Thank you.
And are there any questions for Martyn in regards to this project that he's talked about? Looks like you survived. Well done.